Hi.
Hi. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm awake. I'm alive. I showed up. Hi everyone. My name is Neil Daigle-Orians. I am one of the artists in residence with the for the artist development program at the International Print Center, New York. And with me, I have.
I'm Vin Caponegro, also an artist in residence.
Do you like how I very strategically had you introduce yourself because I had no idea how to pronounce your last name?
It's pretty common.
And welcome. We're going to be kind of in conversation with our projects, talking about what we've been doing with our residency. We had a Zoom meeting a few months ago. Oh my God, where we kind of realized that although our projects are radically different from each other in a lot of ways, there's a lot of really interesting overlaps too. So we ended up just deciding, let's do this as a conversation rather than like two separate little artist talk things. So if you're cool with me jumping into it, I'd like to ask you first about this notion of site and place and materiality and how that all plays a role in this project that you're working on.
Yeah, I mean the project is very specifically linked to the town where I grew up. And just like a little bit of background for folks. I grew up in a place called Easton, Pennsylvania, and it is Lenape land that was colonized really early on. So we're talking like 1730s. It's one of the three sites where the Declaration of Independence was read for the first time. So there's a lot of history there. And in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was a site that, because of the coal fields that are there and the slate quarries and the intersection of two rivers, became this site of like mass exploitation of the earth and of the environment. And my family came over right around that time from South Italy and Sicily and settled in that area specifically because of the industry that was sort of popping up there. So my project is looking specifically at coal, slate, and the silk mills, and then the sort of textile mills that came out of the silk industry. And really thinking about the sort of the way that capitalism created the situation where there's this sort of idea that rich men specifically like go into areas and exploit the nature that's there. The idea that, oh, just because this thing exists here, it is my God-given right to take it out of the earth and use it however I want to use it. And the sort of destruction that they leave behind when they decide that it's no longer profitable for them to be there. And the labor that goes into the actual extraction, right? And how the people who are actually taking these precious materials out of the earth are treated in the conditions under which they're living.
Yeah, so then what I find so interesting about this project too is that you're talking about labor, but then you also have this very material sensitive kind of approach to it, which is also something that I, in a lot of my work, kind of deal with. So I was wondering if you could kind of talk about the coal and Eastonite and all that cool stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I've been making work with coal for decades and slate too. Like I really love slate. So coal, the first pieces of coal I ever made art with were pieces that my grandmother actually had on display in her house.
Oh, wow.
She grew up in a tenement that was like actually literally, it's demolished now, but it was right across the train tracks on a street called Canal Street because the canal, the Lehigh Canal, was right there. You could like see it from where it was. And it was a period of time where like they used coal to heat their home. So my grandmother had this on display, and at some point, I think I was in grad school, I was grinding coal for the first time, and I asked her if I could take it, and she let me. And one of the projects that I'd like to show maybe later is I actually used, she had a couple like souvenirs that were made out of coal that one of my great aunts had given to her and then gave to me. So there's this whole industry of like people making little sculptures out of coal
Wow.
too. Yeah.
That's so cool. And like I love that there's this immediate kind of connection to the materials and the fact that like folks are making whatever with whatever they have
Mm-hmm.
laying around, and that's very much so kind of my own approach to making, since I've been so disconnected from a print shop for so many years, that I'm in what I lovingly refer to as my murder basement, which is my sort of not really finished basement. It's more terrifying on the other side. And like for me, thinking about materials, my project is revolving around a familial lineage as well, with my estranged father's death. And I'm thousands of miles away, not thousands, 1,000 miles away, kind of disconnected from where I grew up, in Nebraska, in Omaha. And so rather than thinking about site and place, a lot of my approach to this project has been more focused on history, and history of its ancestry and lineage. My mother was adopted, and so as a result, I don't actually know what my ethnicity is, mostly. And my father's side of the family, it's complete radio silence. We just kind of have this mutual respect that we don't talk to each other. It's not like out of hate or anything, we just don't. So I grew up in this like very Swedish family, and so I've appropriated a lot of Swedish things for this project. Come to find out, my mom is actually more Scottish than anything. So from there, I've been like researching into Scottish mourning rituals and things like that. And thinking about like this coal and the way that you're using it, it has a very specific color to it. So I also want to ask you about how not only do you use the coal as a material as it stands, but then you also are printing other imagery. So I'm curious about like your choice in color and how you maybe use the coal, maybe you reflect off the coal, especially in like your performances as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I really don't think about color all that much. And I know this is one place where
I'm
we're like,
never not thinking about
right?
color.
I don't really think about it that much. Like I use most of the colors that I use like a very sort of restricted palette. It's mostly things that like come from nature, right? So I'm really into like the greens and like floral colors and things that like sort of pop up in the natural environment, grays, and like I also love like a neon, so that's like my one color. Like I'll just
Yeah.
like there is like a pop. But I really sort of plan things based on like the prints that I made specifically. That's like slate. There's coal, there's Eastonite, which is like this lovely like gray green, and then like there's mica flashes, so it's like a little bit metallic. Um, but most of it is very tied into the nature, like the material object that it's coming from. So I'm not making a lot of like color choices, right? I'm like going from what like nature has already created.
Whereas I'm in this like disco fantasy saturation, I go out of my way to never use actual black pigments. Anytime I want to use anything that is close to black, I try to mix it myself using other colors first. Um, and I just think I mean, it's funny that we're so different in those ways, but like for me, color has always been really important in terms of um, thinking about queerness and how queerness informs a lot of my work, and thinking about what I love most is to create some kind of visual dissonance or disconnect where I'm making this work that's about mourning. It's about this conflicted feeling I have with my father. I'm using these bright colors, these saturated colors. And I like that there's this like visual dissonance as a result of that. But at the same time, I have moments where I'm printing so many colors over and over and over again that they become this like gross neutral gray. And I like that because then there are just hints of like the pinks and the blues and the purples. And so I like being able to like reference that. And I'm really interested in like centering joy in some way, shape, or form. I'm really influenced by Vanessa German, who is this wonderful artist based in Pittsburgh. And she creates these like incredibly emotionally harrowing works about Black pain and the queer Black female experience, queer Black femme experience, but she always uses bright blues, always uses these bright colors. And so I really love that kind of notion of we can talk, multiple things can be true. We can talk about grief, we can talk about mourning, but also use center joy or center celebration in some way, shape, or form. And I also think about how, like thinking about Pride, it's that season already, and how that whole entire celebration essentially is rooted from a moment of extreme queer pain. And so like, yeah, multiple things can be true. And so you mentioned labor earlier, both in terms of like capitalism, in terms of physical labor. And so I'm curious to hear more about your thoughts on labor and how it relates not just to your process conceptually, but also tangibly.
Yeah, I mean, because the project is so like linked to the idea of extraction and then like return of sort of some materials into the earth, I thought it was really important to have some sort of like ritual component of it where I was actually using my body in some way, right? So I set out, originally I was like, I'm going to make an edition of prints and maybe like a ritual that sort of corresponds with it. But it ended up, my project's ending up being in like 3 pieces. So like a series of 3 prints that are sort of souvenir type. They're souvenirs in a way because they don't actually exist anymore, right? So I made 1 coal, 1 slate and lace, and 1 Eastonite print. So I purchased 3 pieces of Eastonite off eBay, and then I buried them. So I don't have them anymore. So like the only memory, the souvenir I have of them is the print, you know? And I actually bought pieces of slate also from Bangor, from where, you know, it's 20 minutes from my house. It's where my grandfather was raised. It's like the slate capital of the world. And printed this lace pattern on them from this lace that my grandmother sort of like coveted. It was her curtains. She gave me like tons of it. It came from the factory that she worked in. And I screen printed the lace onto the slate. And then in part of the ritual, I smashed it to pieces. So it only exists now like this.
Wow. I mean, as an object, that's gorgeous.
And then I left some of it on the site too, right? Sure. So it was important to me in the ritual to drag things on the same paths that the mules would have used when they were dragging slate and coal on the barges, right? To walk in some of those same areas to make something beautiful and then smash it and then like leave some of the shards of slate behind in those spaces, right? To bury the Eastonite and then actually made like a coal, like a ring of protective coal around myself. And then I buried it. And then I sprinkled aster seeds, which is a native flower to the area, and then used coal water to sort of water them. So this idea of like, you know, like I didn't personally take this from you, right? But I've benefited from the extraction of material there. You know, like my life is centered in this spot because of the horrible things that have been done to the earth there. So, just acknowledging the sacrifice that's happened there on multiple levels, right? And then we're talking about like the actual like labor and the unions and all the fights that had happened there, which is actually really sad because I live with the consequences of the sort of all the industry leaving that area, right? So in the early 1900s, like the IWW was super successful in textile, the International Workers of the World was super successful in Paterson, New Jersey, and in Lawrence, Massachusetts, with silk mill workers. And because of that, because they were successful there, the industry actually moved to Pennsylvania to sort of to exploit the labor of the women and children who were in these large families where the men were working in the mines. And because the work was so unstable and the money that the salaries were, they weren't salaries, they were paid by cart, but like the payment was so low and there was such a high risk of injury, the towns actually sought out sort of these further exploitations, right? So sort of how like a couple years ago, Amazon was searching for a place and all the cities were like, come to us, come to us, come to our workers.
Hartford experienced that hard.
You know, 120 years ago. It's the same exact cycle that's happening. So the choices that were made then affected, my life. And then think about it all the time because all the research I've been doing, some of the books are from the 70s. And they're like, well, at least we still have steel and we still have the textile mills. And it's just heartbreaking to read them now,
Yeah.
because all that's gone now too, right? Like the silk mill in Easton is luxury condos. The factory where my grandmother worked and all my great aunts worked for like decades is a Dunkin' Donuts. Like they tore it down. There's a CVS there.
Yeah.
Beth Steele's a casino.
Goodness.
So watching this sort of the decline and then also like the PR that happened as all these industries were leaving, right? That they left people with the idea that we're leaving because the unions got greedy instead of we're leaving because we realize we can't exploit you anymore, that you're not going to back down to our demands. So we're going to go and try the southern United States. And when that doesn't work, we're going to go overseas. So I grew up in this sort of like conflicting environment where we're told the unions are great, you need them, right? Like successful employee-ship, like the factory worker needs a union. But also the loss of the union or the loss of the factories is directly linked to unions specifically getting too greedy, which like spoiler, that's not what happened,
Yeah.
like, and then sort of that dichotomy. And I've been in unions my entire teaching career. I'm very thankful for that. Like I'm a union member right now. So like learning that history and seeing all of it happen, and the continuation of this like cycle of history, I think is really interesting.
Yeah, and like where your project is tackling labor on that very like tangible kind of conceptual, sure, Neil, words. I just got home from teaching. I'm all spent. Where you're kind of thinking about labor in the very like market kind of focused thing. I was thinking about the emotional aspects of my labor. Thinking about how micro focused my project is on my particular narrative. Labor kind of is something that I'm constantly haunted by in a way because I realize in creating this work, I'm engaging in a process where I'm putting way more effort and labor into this work than I ever did my relationship with my estranged father. And he was estranged for a reason, involving alcoholism and all sorts of fun stuff like that. So I try not to feel guilty about it, but at the same time, there's just a thing lingering in the back of my head as I'm making these prints, engaging in a very physical process too. These are collagraph prints that I make the collagraph plate on just like a simple piece of chipboard, and then I'm rolling it up with ink and hand printing it with a Baron, multiple layers over and over again. And so I'm exerting myself while I'm doing this. I'm not really in shape, so that's probably part of it. But I'm like engaging in this kind of very physical action where like I just keep thinking like this could have been a hug, this could have been a handshake, this could have been like responding to an email, this could have been all sorts of things, and instead here I am doing this while I'm trying to understand how to grieve the loss of somebody that for all intents and purposes I already lost decades ago, but now the death is like real, which in 2019 for context, so like 3 years now I've been working on this project. I also like to think of, and I like to frame art as a constant residue of bodily action and gestures, no matter what your process is, including the labor associated with those gestures, even something as simple as like the click of a shutter, or the typing of code if you're into new media. That's all like these physical actions that we're doing, and then the result is this thing or this experience or this video. So I'm constantly thinking about labor in those kinds of regards, and how much labor do I want to put into something? How much can I do it? And recently I realized that this whole labor, this whole work, this effort that I'm putting into this project is this really strange way of me showing him that I love him, but not because of any like fond memories, not because of my childhood. None of that exists, but I do. So I have to be grateful in some way, shape, or form, because without him, I wouldn't be. So Messy, nuanced, gross. It's too early for that. I know it's like 2:30 on Friday, but it's too early. um, so Emma had actually reached out to us via the questions in the comments, which everybody can do, which I should say out loud. And Emma asks, regarding the recent exhibition Unfinished, which is what the exhibition we were a part of, what is your take, both for both of us, on the concept of unfinished in concept with our practice or our project? And I can go first if you want. So in thinking about like Unfinished, the reason why I submitted in the first place to the exhibition was thinking about the notion of grieving as a constantly unfinished process. Mourning, loss, it's something that stays with us no matter what. We can move on from it. We can no longer be hurt by it as immediately as we once were, but it's something that we physically carry with us. And so I see this project as something that is definitely unfinished in the regards of I haven't really made the things, the performances, the objects that I want to yet, but also unfinished in the sense that I'm just always going to be thinking about the what ifs, the what could have beens, things like that, and how my concept of myself is also constantly changing. I realized very early on in this project that I'm kind of using our relationship as a means to explore my own identity, both in terms of like gender and sexuality, but also thinking on this much larger scale of like, what am I as a person? And so that's a constantly fluid process. That is never finished. That is never changing. No matter how stable you might feel today, you will change in 3 years. And so thinking about Unfinished, it made so much sense to me to submit. It made so much sense to me to be a part of that conversation, especially thinking about okay, yeah, my brain's fried. That's all I got on that. But how about for you, thinking about Unfinished, the installation that you did in the exhibition, as well as how your project is maybe taking on that?
Yeah, so it's funny because when I talk about family, I'm talking specifically about my mother's family because I don't know anything about my father's family. My father is alive. We are also estranged.
Relatable,
So like I don't
relatable.
know. I actually did a little bit of research, maybe in the last couple of years, and it was actually 2 or 3 years ago because I was curious, like where my ancestors were from on that side of the family, and they ended up being Scottish, Irish, and German, and something else I can't remember. A little bit Native American, and then something else that I can't remember. But in doing like genealogy, there's a chance that one of like my great 10th great grandmothers was someone who lived in Boston, and I got really interested in her, and her name was Elizabeth Cornell, and she was actually, they think she was murdered or she died under suspicious circumstances, but it's a case where her son was executed over spectral evidence. Like they brought spectral evidence into the court. So the idea that like Elizabeth came to her other son in a dream and said, this person murdered me, and they brought that as testimony in the court, and he was put to death.
Oh my
like
God.
in colonial New England, right? So that started all this research into spectral evidence for me, and the piece that I had in Unfinished was actually a sort of spell for all the victims of the Salem witch trials, and for anyone who was sort of punished with this, under this idea of like purity, right? Like punished for witchcraft or for being othered under the guise of like religious purity. So my print was it was a dandelion. It was on a stone wall, so it had all of these like Salem connections to the specific people who were imprisoned and then who lost their lives. And I had collected snow from the grave site of William Stoughton, who was the person who allowed spectral evidence in the Salem witch trial cases. So there was this connection there where I started thinking about sort of the reason it sort of became apparent to me to like apply for the Unfinished show was like, this is feels like it's such an ongoing thing, right? Like not the idea of spectral evidence so much, but the punishment of people who are othered, whether they actually are participating in the thing that they're sort of on trial for or not, on trial or like actually on trial for. Um, so that's sort of like where that tied into. The my project doesn't have there's not a direct connection between the work that's in Unfinished and this project, because I feel like this spectral evidence was very much like um, a sort of nod to history and to other folks who have been really traumatized by puritanical beliefs, which I feel very strongly like living in New England. I'm not from New England. I grew up, in Easton, an hour from Philly, an hour from New York, and then I spent a decade in Chicago. And coming to Boston, I was sort of shocked by how puritanical ideologies are still to this day, like how it has like infiltrated the psyche of the city. So that was very much part of that project. And this feels so much so different in like its scope because they are really based on like the sites that they're about.
But like that connection to history and just this notion, like I've been teaching an art history course all semester long for community college here in Hartford, and it's something that I've been really pushing with my students all semester long is that history itself has an agenda. It's not as objective as we like to think it is. And so I've been super critical of this textbook all semester long, where I'm like, why are we taking an entire like 50-page chapter for just 15th century Italy, and then we have 20 pages on the entirety of Pacific Islander culture? What's up with that? Who made that choice? And so, like, even thinking about whether it's the Salem witch trials, which are also kind of undergoing this like kind of new thing, this conversation about how it's like, hey, it wasn't really white women. I mean, it was, but it was mostly women of color. Tituba was a woman of color, and indigenous women and black women, especially. So like, even that is like, okay, we always need to be constantly reevaluating history and our relationship to it. And I mean, that does lead to an interesting question. I did have a question about history, which we've kind of talked about a little bit here and there. But one of the other things that I'm just remembering right now is our connection to Chicago. Because I was born in a suburb of Chicago. I have a Cook County birth certificate and everything. And I grew up in an evangelical childhood. We were part of the Evangelical Covenant Church. Moving to New England and experiencing that puritanical thing was basically like, oh, it's my childhood, but like with a black and white aesthetic. Like it's similar ideas. I'm used to this, and also the cemeteries are much older. That is essentially the difference between my childhood and New England. So like we both are thinking about history in this really interesting way. The work that I had in the exhibition were based on this Swedish practice called funeral candies, where these candies would be given out to mourners in 19th century Sweden, and they were never meant to be eaten, to the point where bakers and confectioners would actually mix chalk into the candies themselves because sugar in Sweden in 19th century, hot commodity. And the boxes themselves are these like gorgeous, weird objects that are incredibly Nordically morbid. There was one where the decoration on it said something to the effect of baptized in haste, because it was for a baby who had died. And they just have these like black frills, and they often used etchings or lithographs as the main decoration because they could print a bunch of them and slap them on these boxes. So I had like kind of recreated those, but using my father's vices of cigarettes and alcohol to as the decoration, along with one of them said like Harry is dead, and these like glittery resin things I cast. I made out of polymer clay and acrylic. I made these little cigarettes and little bottle caps and things like that. Again, very bright colored, saturated. I like that weird stuff. um, so another question I wanted to ask you um, is kind of going into the actual materiality of it all. We both live in this world of print. We both live in this world of printmaking. So I'm curious, like, not only like, how did you find printmaking, but also like, why do you continue to use printmaking or printed materials in your process? You use a lot of, I've only ever read it, I've never actually said it, risograph?
There's a huge debate. I say re, but
Rizzo,
yeah,
Rizo.
yes,
I've only ever read it.
yeah.
But you use that and like you create these patterns, you create these wallpapers. I'm interested in kind of talking more about like why print, especially since we're here on this fancy Instagram.
I mean, I came to print. In college, I was a political science major who I went abroad to Rome and took my first printmaking class. So even though I had been like making things for like the entirety of my existence, I had never stumbled into printmaking. And something in my brain was just like, oh shit, like this is the thing for me, right? So I sort of went from political science into theory, into aesthetics, into art history. And I actually wrote my thesis on internet art.
Ooh.
And I went to grad school for printmaking, you know? So I found this sort of this the way that printmaking and multiples in general like create this accessibility to work, I find really, really it's like an integral part of like not just my artistic practice, but the way that like I interact with the world, right? Like if something is written in a way that's not accessible, it's not for me, right? Like if something is physically inaccessible to some people, I think that's a problem, right? Like I feel like accessibility, like everyone should have access to the stuff, especially to art, because you know, like growing up in Easton, Pennsylvania, I didn't even go into an art museum until I was in college. You know, like art was something that I did, but out of like this sort of like physical need to do it, but not something I was really exposed to, right? And the idea that I would be an artist was just like not a thing, right? Like I come from my family's like working in factories. My mom went to college right before I did, you know, so like this untraditional, like we were the first sort of people to go to college. So me graduating with an art history degree was like weird enough for them. They're like, what are you going to do with this degree? But I think about the sort of the love I have of disseminating things too. Like when we moved to Boston, I lost access to the shop I was printing in. I had a studio in Chicago and I came to this place that's very expensive. And unless you have like ties to an academic institution, really hard to find space to print in. So I actually bought like the cheapest laser copier I could find and started a small press. You know, and that grew into, and now we have a risograph, which is actually like right behind me, because I feel like the desire to put things out into the world is like really strong in me, and I love the idea of the surrender that comes from that, right? Like you create something, or you help someone else create something, because like I publish things for other people too, and then it goes out into the world, and you have zero control over it anymore. You don't know whose hands, who's touching it, who's reading it. And the same thing with like a lot of the performance that I do ends up on YouTube, you know, and like I have no idea like who's watching it and what context they're watching it. Like, but so many more people get to see it and experience it than they would if I was creating like unique pieces.
You used my favorite word ever to describe printmaking, and that's dissemination. Like sincerely,
Yeah.
I think about print as like the dissemination of information, whether that is through like multiple etchings or multiple lithographs, but then also thinking about like in my class today we talked about riot girl zines, and we talk about like queer feminist and queer zine culture and how like it kind of died because LiveJournal, but also still has like a very strong kind of like vibe continuing today, oftentimes in arts context, but also still in this very DIY kind of thing. And like being able to like compare like throwing your zine out there to publishing a fan fiction on AO3 or something like that. My students were like, oh, I get it. And so like I think it's also funny that I had a very similar experience with kind of stumbling into print. Very early in my undergrad experience, though, my first semester of undergrad. And in retrospect, it makes so much sense why print resonated with me as much, because when I was 28, so this is like well after grad school, I was finally diagnosed with ADHD. And it was just like, oh my God, my entire life makes sense. I had this context for like my brain and everything. And thinking about print is so, it fascinates me. It allows me to be very scientifical. I get to use chemicals. I get to like play with nitric acid on lithostones and think about pH and all that fun stuff. I get to use drawing tools. I also get to use photography. I can incorporate digital tools. We can think about new media. And it all kind of fits within this greater idea. I can be super intellectual thinking about these ideas of publishing and the democratization of information. Print allowed me to do that. So like in retrospect, I very much so connected to like, oh, it's my neurodivergence, haha. My drawing teacher was like, hey, you would like dry point. I was like, I sure do, friend. And like I literally in my notes for this talk, I have dissemination of information under print. I want you to know that. Like, you sincerely were just like, yes. But like also thinking about printmaking as ritual is something that I find really interesting, especially those really hardcore old school techniques, thinking about like engraving and etching and litho, the connection to history and this ritualistic process of I'm basically using the same tools that have been used for hundreds of years. And it reminds me again of like my own religious upbringing and how like there's prayer, there's communion, there's all these sorts of rituals that we engage in. And print allows us to kind of do that in a very different way, a way that I feel we're kind of disconnected from sometimes. But I don't know. I just like pretending like I'm Albrecht Dürer when I'm like wiping an Italio plate, just like I'm fancy. And in your email to me too, you mentioned turning this project into a zine. Yeah, and you mentioned your writing, and so I wanna hear more about this writing.
Yeah, it's so funny that you mentioned ADHD too, because like it has been recently, I never thought about printmaking as like a neurodivergent dream, but it has also recently been pointed out to me by my therapist that I may be dabbling in the ADHD pool, and I'm 38 years old, so like,
Better late than never, girl.
reading the description to me, I was like, oh yeah, but I do think that like now that you've said it out loud, I'm like, oh my God, that makes so much sense, right? Like just pulling from all these different areas. And I feel like zines are sort of like my practice is a culmination of all of those things, right? Like especially the zine. So the zine that I'm going to work on, it's going to be sort of a collection of the research. Also, like for the record, I fought really hard against making a zine in the beginning. Fought myself. I wasn't allowed to make one. But I was like, oh, like I have this money that I have access to now. I'm gonna make like I haven't made edition prints in so long. Like I'm gonna really go for it. And then I started doing all this research, and in addition to like the things I've been collecting over the years, and I was just like, ooh, I really think this needs to be a zine. I was like, I'm not gonna fight it. So it's going to be some of the research, some of my own writing that I've been doing over the last like couple of years, specifically about like extraction. And it will be some documentation of like the rituals that that took place. So like the ritual will exist. I'm going to edit the video. It will be like its own standalone piece. But then screenshots of it, parts of it will go into the book itself too.
That's super cool. I too am making a zine, but it's gonna be a bit before I think it comes out. I started working on it very early into the process, and it's a coloring book titled oh, what did I call it? Explaining the death of my father to my childhood self. And so I'm making like a coloring book where I'm telling like 8-year-old Neil pre-parent divorce, pre-moving to Omaha, what's going to happen. and try to kind of using the languages of coloring books and children's media to kind of explain these things to this previous version of myself, engaging in what therapists often call like part therapy. And I started laying it out, and I'm like, this is gonna be like 30 pages. I don't have time to do this while also teaching full time. I'm sorry. So I started, I have it like a lot of it laid, like storyboarded essentially, at least conceptually. I know I'll write this here and I'll write this here. I have the intro written out. It was after I wrote the intro, I'm like, this is like 5 pages of coloring book. I'm not going to be able to just like pull this out. But I'm using the, what I've been working on, something I haven't really talked about yet today is this library of woodcuts and linocuts of they're objects that remind me of my father. So I have anything from like a crushed beer can to bowling pins and bowling balls. You can kind of see some of it popping through. That's where the imagery comes from. I have his 1994 Ford Taurus that I print in the same green that he had it in. 6 packs of beer, Marlboro Reds, things like that. So those are going to be dotted throughout it and like allow my childhood self to draw into it. And I've got plenty of time before I'll ever actually publish it, but I'm debating back and forth on whether or not I want to put it into the world only as like something the viewer can fill out, or if I also want to make like a printed version, like a short edition of me filling it out. And I'm going to have access to a risograph in the near future that can apparently print 6 colors at a time, which I'm like, what? That's a thing? So watch my feed. We'll see what happens. And like this is a question coming out of nowhere, but you kind of already brushed up on it. How has the project changed? Like you talked about how like the zine was something you were resisting at the beginning, but then it kind of fit into it. Is there anything else that like well, we kind of already talked about it, but is there anything else that maybe changed throughout this process where you're like, no, I need to do this now, or I need to in the future shift to something else?
Not really. It's sort of one of those things where like because I do so much of my work is so research heavy that there are points when like I will be, and this happens in my practice a lot, like I'll have a dream where a part of it will reveal itself to me. So there have been like little reveals and then it just sort of like built into itself. And then by the end, that was the zine was the only thing where I was only resisting it because zines and making books have become so much a part of my creative practice now, that I was hoping to sort of go back into some of my previous works where like when I had access to a print shop, and then luckily I do now, but for years I didn't have access to a print shop. So it was sort of like I was making zines and making other things because of a lack, so I would make a couple books, but it wasn't like the bulk of my practice. And it's actually really funny to have the experience where you're like, oh, I'm going to go back and do this thing that I've been missing for so long. And then as so often happens, you're like, well, actually this also needs to be a book.
Yeah.
Like you're like, I resisted it, but only because I felt like I had this opportunity to do something else. And then once I did it, I was like, that felt great, but also this needs to be a book.
Yeah, I remember looking over like my actual proposal of what I put in. I had this whole thing about ordering photopolymer letterpress plates and printing those by hand. I had this whole thing where I was going to do that. I was thinking about obituaries and doing. I started generating obituaries for my father via artificial intelligence, which are like total gobbledygook, but they're kind of hilarious and also kind of sad. All the while making portraits of him based on Google image searches of his name and just putting together these like mashed up, almost exquisite corpse-like portraits of these men who show up when I type in Harry Orian's obituary. And like, so that was the whole plan. And then I just got notification this morning that one of the supplies I ordered is finally en route. And I'm just, I had this whole thing about screen printing. I have like 10 screens and I can just do it I can print down here, run upstairs, and wash out my screen in the sink, whatever. And I actually had to shift a lot because I didn't actually get the supplies that I originally ordered in time. So I have, what I did do was I actually used this as an opportunity to finally explore Akua-based ink, soy-based inks. And I'm not a convert. I'm not a convert. But I am pleasantly surprised. It's not nearly as difficult or weird as I remember it being in undergrad. Maybe they've changed the formula in the decades since, but I just remember like hating every moment of trying to use an Akua ink in undergrad. And now I'm in my basement, like, you know, I should wear gloves, but I don't necessarily have to because no solvents. And I'm just washing everything with Simple Green, and it feels better. It washes off my hands a lot easier. And I'm less scared to exist in my basement now that my oil-based inks are packed away somewhere. So with that in mind, my last question is, what's next for Vin?
Yeah, well, printing the zine, editing the video are like first on my list. Hopefully that'll be, you know, I'm hoping that both of those things will be done at some point over the summer. Also, sometime by the solstice, another Boston-based artist, Maria Molteni, is making this ground mural. And they've invited me to collaborate with them to create some sort of like ritual. The spot is in between the Columbus Park. So the Columbus statue got beheaded in Boston a couple years ago. And they took down the statue, but the pillar remains, and the park is still named Columbus Park. So the spot where Maria's painting is between Columbus Park and Faneuil Hall, which is like a notorious spot where enslaved people were auctioned off. So there's all this like really intense history going on there. So we're going to collaborate and do some kind of ritual, and possibly like publish some sort of like text to go with their mural, which is going to be beautiful.
That's so cool.
So that's for me. It's exciting. And sometime around the summer solstice. So.
Unfortunately, I won't be around. I mean, I'm only an hour and a half from Boston, but I feel like my life is embodying the title of Everything Everywhere All at Once right now. I received a notification for this residency, and then everything snowballed in such a wonderful way. So I have a residency at Stoveworks, which is a relatively new space in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I'm really excited about. So I'll be there for a month, and then I will be at some point in the month of July, while I'm in Chattanooga, driving up to Cincinnati, because I am moving to Cincinnati because I got a job at the University of Cincinnati. So
congratulations. I saw you post something, and I knew that you were doing an interview, and I was like, oh, I hope it's that job.
Yeah, I got it. I got the thing. And so my life has been completely upended in all the best ways possible. I have to throw out like everything. And then in the middle of doing that, I have a solo exhibition at the Jacksonville University in Jacksonville, Florida. Unfortunately, it's not this project. It's something entirely different because, again, ADHD, explaining everything. It's a whole project about landscape painting and the politics of it. So like I have to do all that while also somehow moving across the country. I'm gonna make it work. I have no choice. But yeah, that's what's new for me. And do you have anything else you want to share with the audience while we've got them?
No, I'm good. Thank you so much for, taking the lead and generating such a lovely conversation. And thanks to IPCNY for giving us this opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Emma. Thank you, the education director, formerly known as Megan. Thank you, everybody. Congratulations, IPCNY, as well, for moving. That's super exciting for all of y'all. And follow me at Neil Makes Things. You can follow Vin on their profile, which is actually linked to this. I'm not, so follow me at Neil Makes Things. Spoiler alert, I make things. But otherwise, everybody have a lovely rest of the day. It's beautiful in the Northeast. Go outside, touch grass. It's wonderful. Okay, bye, Vin.
Bye. Thanks.